My name is Bruce Barnes. I'm a member of the New Bedford Preservation Society, the sponsors of tonight's tour. This is what we do, a tour like this every year. We call it the VIP tour, where we highlight houses and the individuals that were important in New Bedford's history that lived in the houses. And at this particular house, well, let me talk about the house first. A very important house here in New Bedford. The Rotch Jones Duff House and Garden Museum was originally built by William Rotch Jr., who was one of New Bedford's most distinguished citizens in the early years of the Republic and New Bedford's history. He built this house in 1834. He was already, at that time, he was about 75 years old. His first house, by the way, if you're familiar with New Bedford and the historic district, was the Mariners' Home, a big house right across the street from the Whaling Museum. Anyway, he built this house. He had this house built in 1834, and the Roaches were very well known for hiring top-of-the-line architects for their projects. And for this house, they hired an itinerant architect, basically a young man, immigrant from England. His name was Richard Upjohn. He designed this house, one of his earliest projects, and Upjohn became one of the most famous architects in the country during his lifetime. He did this house. It's one of his first commissions. A lot of times, some people think this was his very first residential building that he ever designed. I don't think that's the truth. I think he had a couple other buildings. He started out in Salem and moved around trying to find communities where there was a lot of wealthy patrons. But anyway, he designed this house there. He moved on to Newport. He did a number of, if you're familiar with the Bellevue Avenue buildings, he did King's Coat, kind of a Gothic revival house, and also his house, the King House in Newport, is one of the most important Victorian houses in the country. But he designed this house in 1834, the prevailing style at the time, the Greek Revival. The big mansions on County Street, for the most part during this period, from the mid-1820s until around 1850, really, were designed in this style. It emulated Greek temple architecture. And that's what Upjohn did here. Now, one of the interesting, this is a very nice house. It doesn't stand out like some of the big granite houses, the one right next door and the Grinnell Mansion across the street from that. But still, it's an interesting house. And one of the nice things, if you have the chance to walk around this house, every side is kind of unique. Every side is interesting. You know, there was actually a sunroom on the porch side at one point, but nonetheless, even now, the sides are interesting. So, you know, the architects are like that. They're very detail oriented. They don't want to, they try to dress up every space they can. And that's what he did here. But another interesting thing about this house is that the foundation of this house is brick. It's a brick house clad in wood. Very interesting. If you're familiar with the Mariners' Home, that's also a brick house, and just the facade in the front is of wood. The whole house is brick otherwise. Interesting construction technique, but that's what the case is here. Now, there were three families that owned this house as residences. The first was William Rotch Jr., second was a lady by the name of Amelia Jones, and the third was a man by the name of Mark Duff. And Mark Duff's father was really a very, very interesting and important man in his lifetime. Duff was the son of I think that his father was an Irish immigrant, came to this country probably in the late 1840s. His name was David Duff, and David Duff was a teamster. He had a wagon and a horse, and he carried goods from wherever, from the waterfront or wherever he needed to homes. He was a delivery man. And he had a family, and one of his sons was named John. And John decided, when he became of age, that he would, that just being a one-horse teamster was not a way to live. And he developed, over a period of about 10 years, an empire in delivering coal. He went from one horse and one wagon to a stable of 200 horses with all the accompanying wagons that go along. He was the major deliverer of coal in the city. And he made a lot of money doing that. He owned most of Fish Island. If you're familiar with Fish Island, which is just off, you know, he kind of bought Fish Island, parts of Fish Island. He pretty much owned the whole thing to store all his coal. But John, and he became very well-to-do. But John realized that the delivery business was not the way to go. Now you have to realize, these are the 1890s, first couple decades of the 20th century. New Bedford is growing like crazy, not only residentially, but the textile mills are flooding the waterfront. There are about 30 separate corporations that developed into textile mills during the period from 1880 to 1910. And they continued to build new mills all the time. And each one of those mills had a power plant to run the mill. And just one mill would use hundreds of tons of coal a day. So John Duff must have seen that and said, let's just drop this delivery to homes and maybe to things, and let's broker and wholesale all this coal. And that's what he did. He became a very, very wealthy man. He was one of the leaders in the community during his lifetime. Now, Duff was Catholic. He was an Irishman, he was Catholic, and one of his great beneficiaries and philanthropies was St. Lawrence Church. He rebuilt the altar in St. Lawrence. He bought a lot of land around St. Lawrence to give to the church. The property where Our Lady Holy Family High School is now was on land that Duff bought for the church. He was also involved in all the other enterprises that the wealthy New Bedford people were involved in. He was on the boards of numerous textile mills, not all the banks, but many banks, all the other businesses in town. He was a real player, important man in the city during his lifetime. He had 4 children, one of whom was Mark Duff. And Mark became a very important man in New Bedford as well. He was the president of the Merchants Bank. The Merchants Bank, which is the marble bank downtown on Purchase Street, right across the street from No Problemo. That was the Merchants Bank, and that was the major investment bank and trust company in the city. It managed all the assets of the citizens and of the businesses for the most part in New Bedford. So it was a big deal. And Duff bought the house here. Mark Duff bought the house here after Amelia Jones died in 1935, and he lived in it until the late 70s. And his estate sold the house to the city, which eventually passed on to Whale, and they developed it into a house museum over the next few years. Now, a couple of other things about Duff that I want to mention. The inspiration from really my talk on Duff is his great-grandson. His name was William Kenny. And William Kenny's grandmother was one of John Duff's children. Her name was Nora. And he told me a lot of the information here tonight about his great-grandfather. He's a good guy. He's been a long-time supporter of the Preservation Society, and I'm sure the other cultural institutions in the city as well. Good guy. He's pretty elderly now. I probably shouldn't say this because he probably watched the video, but he gave us a lot of information about where John lived. John Duff lived in the Wilson Chapel. If you're familiar with Wilson Chapel, that was one of his first houses. He bought that around 1900 and remodeled it for himself. When it became more commercial, that end of County Street came more commercial. He moved from that house and he bought a house that we're actually going to visit tonight on Hawthorne Street, 81 Hawthorne Street. He remodeled that house in the mid-20s for his final resting place, or final place where he died. If you've been to St. Mary's Cemetery in the city right across the street from Shaw's supermarket, if you've ever walked in there, or if you have someone you've visited a tombstone there, you've seen the big mausoleum in the middle of it. That's John Duff's mausoleum in St. Mary's Cemetery. He was a big benefactor of Catholic causes. He was acknowledged by the Pope, actually, for his contributions to Catholicism in America in the early 1910s and 20s. He was actually, as well, involved in politics, and he was the postmaster for the city for a while, from 1900 to 1912. He was responsible for having the new post office on Pleasant Street built in 1911. He was appointed by the Republican presidents, Teddy Roosevelt and Howard Taft. Taft, I think, came to visit New Bedford at one point during the, at some point. And he was, when Taft was voted out of office, John decided he probably wouldn't be reappointed as postmaster, so he left that position. So he was very interested, very involved in all sorts of things. Died in 1936. He was such an important man. He had an obituary in the New York Times, actually. Pretty long obituary in the New York Times. So an important guy during his time. And his legacy is not as well known as others, but in his own day, he was a big deal. And as a Catholic, now I know that a lot of people have said, have claimed that the first Catholic to be in the Wamsutta Club was in the 50s or 60s, but John Duff is listed as a member of the Wamsutta Club during his lifetime, and he died in 1936. This building behind me, which is the parish house, or the parish house for Our Lady of Assumption Church, was originally the home of a woman by the name of Mary Roach. It was right on South 6th Street, right on the street. There'll be a picture of the house on the video, so you can see exactly what it looks like. And it's been on the, if you're familiar with the New Bedford Historic Photo Club, there's a number of pictures of this house that you can look up. Just look up Mary Roach and it'll probably pop right up. And Mary Roach is a very interesting lady. She's a daughter of William Rotch Sr. Her brother was William Rotch Jr., the guy whose house we were just at. She was the last child of the William Rotch Sr. and his wife Elizabeth. There's 20 years between her oldest sibling and herself. She was born in 1777, and her sister Elizabeth was born in 1757. Now, if you've been to my tours or if you've watched the videos, I did a thing about the schism at the Friends Meeting House and the Quaker religion. And I mentioned, and it was a VIP like tour for tonight, and I talked about Elizabeth, but it was Elizabeth and Mary who together were the people that were trying to change and sort of modernize the Quaker teachings and religion during that time. It didn't work, but she was one of the ones that tried to do that. She was a very religious woman. She's very famous in her own time. She had, the Roaches and the Rodmans, the two most important families, were very interconnected in a family way because they intermarried a lot. And so, she had lots of nieces and nephews. She was an important person in town. She was referred to as Aunt Mary most of her life. And she was very, and when they left the Quaker meeting, they became Unitarians. But she was always really, all those people that left the Quaker meeting during that time because of the differences between what they called the old lights and the new lights, the ones that left the meeting really never stopped being Quakers. They always thought in the same way and considered their relationship with God in the same way. That was Mary's thing. She was very, very religious, and her thing was the inner light, how you're individually related to God. And so she, so when she went to the Unitarian Church, which is a lot more ritualistic than the Friends meetings, she, just dismissed all the paraphernalia, as it were. She didn't go for communion. She didn't go for any of these other things, sacraments and so forth. The only thing that mattered was the inner light. And so, she went to Unitarian Church regularly. And in the 1830s, one of the substitute preachers who was hired to come for a short time when the regular minister was away was William Ralph Waldo Emerson, very, very famous philosopher and thinker. At the time, he was a pretty young man, and he was taken by Mary's feelings about church and inner strength and so forth. And they became close friends. He cited her often in his writings early on. They continued to be correspondence until she died in 1848. Mary was involved. Mary was never married. She had taken care of her elderly parents until she was 51. The elderly parents lived in what was called the Mansion House. Mansion House was on the corner of 2nd and Union Street. There's the credit unions there now. That was where the Mansion House was. Mary was willed the Mansion House, but it was such a big building. She didn't live there. She decided that she would build this house at some point instead. Mary never married, but she had a partner. Her name was Mary Gifford. And she and Mary lived together in this house for the rest of their lives. And when Mary Rotch died, she willed not only the house, but all her money to Mary Gifford, which was kind of remarkable, considering that she had so many nieces and nephews, although all the Roaches and Rodwoods were wealthy anyway. But anyway, she did that. And then one of the interesting things, too, Mary was a fairly young woman when she first started to be Mary Roach's companion. And so she lived quite a life afterwards as well. And she took up with another woman and lived in the house. But when Mary Gifford died, she willed all the money back to the Roach family. I thought that was kind of cool. Well, all the money that she still had, she willed back to the Roaches. Kind of a cool thing. And not that they really needed it, but I think she just felt an obligation. She had been given this, this great wealth because of her friendship and companionship with Mary Roach, and she gave the money back. Anyway, kind of an interesting thing. This particular house, really, when you look at the pictures of what it looked like when it was built, it doesn't look that much different. I mean, of course, the vinyl siding is a lot different, but the form of the house, this is what the house looked like. It's kind of different, kind of interesting. There's more detailing probably than you'll see, but basically this is the form that you'll see in the picture. It was right on South 6th Street. When Our Lady of Assumption purchased the property, and they wanted to put the church right on South 6th Street, they just moved the house back. There's pictures of that actually as well on the Historic Photos website, in the Bedford Historic Photos website. I have a picture of what it looked like, all the beams underneath as they moved the house back. Kind of interesting. Anyway, that's a brief story about Mary Roach. Very interesting person in her day. She was very philanthropic as well with, at the time in New Bedford, working on charities for the poor and so forth, and also for the church. The house we're going to talk about is the one right across the street, the tan one. It was built in 1860. Original owner, and on the plaque, his name was Barton Ricketson. But he didn't live in the house very long, because the family that I'm going to talk about here purchased the house in 1860 and lived in it for a long time, probably until the, 1930s or 40s even. And that's the Prescott family. And the man I'm going to talk about tonight is Oliver Prescott. The Prescott family is one of the most important families in the city during the era of the development of the textile industry, and even into the 1980s, actually. There were 3 Oliver Prescotts. The first Oliver Prescott was the one who moved in this house. He was a lawyer and a judge. He was very well-to-do by the time he passed away, but he married when he was 55 to a woman who was 25. So, and that was about 1860 or so. He had 3 children. He had another Oliver and 2 daughters, Mary, who went by Molly, and Helen, who married a man named Stetson. And Oliver is the subject of the talk tonight. He was born in 1868, died in 1938. He went through the usual, he was born into a wealthy family. His father had made good money. He was born in this house. And he went through the usual schedule of life events to get to where to get to be a lawyer. He went to Friends Academy, boarding school, Harvard for his bachelor's and MA, and then he started working for the most important law firm in the city. And he made a lot of money. He was involved in so many activities it's hard to believe he had time for half of them. Not only commercial activities, he was on the boards of numerous banks, numerous textile mills. He was a president of Wamsutter Mill for a while. He was on all kinds of charitable boards, all kinds of things. It's hard to believe he had much time to do much of anything. Much of the information I got about Oliver, was from a memoir that his daughter had written in 1980. It was called Mariano. And Mariano came from the estate that he bought on Tucker Road in Dartmouth. If you're familiar with there's like a convent now. The house is set back quite a ways from the street, but you can still see the house. It was built in that was his house for his recent bride. He bought this 200 or 300 acre farm. The family was named Mariano, 2 N's at the end there, Mariano. And they were Italian immigrants, and they sold the farm to Oliver and his family. Most of the wealthy New Bedford people at the time, the mill owners and the people who owned the banks and stuff, the big hobby for those people was to own a yacht. That was the big thing. You owned a yacht. The biggest yacht actually at the New Bedford Yacht Club at Hayden Aram was called the Palestine. It was enormous. It was one of the major mill owners at the time. But lots of guys had yachts. That was instead of whatever rich people do today, buy fancy cars, I guess, or something, they owned yachts. But Oliver didn't want to do that. He didn't want a yacht. He wanted a farm. Buying Mariano with a couple hundred acres of land, one of his goals was to continue to have the farm be profitable. He didn't work the farm himself. He hired people to do the farm. Built a big house in front of the farm, but he kept all the farm buildings, and he had a farm manager, and it was an interesting thing. It was primarily a dairy farm, but they had all sorts of equipment. He had the makings of a normal farm in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And he managed that farm very, very carefully. He had a farm manager, as I said. He didn't do any of the field work or anything like that, but he made sure that the farm was profitable, and that was his hobby, was the farm. So it was interesting. It was an interesting thing for him to get involved in, I thought. You can still see the house actually from the street. I didn't drive down there. There's a long driveway. It's a order of nuns, retired nuns that I think own that property now. I didn't want to drive down there in case, but it's still a nice house. It looks like a mansion, and it is a mansion. Now, Oliver and his father and his son, they worked at this law firm, and the law firm was the biggest and the most important law firm in the city. And they managed the funds of the textile mills. They managed the funds of people, their estates, their housing transactions, everything. And they had done so for many, many years. Well, I had a friend who actually worked for the firm, the subsequent firm in the 1960s. And she said they had so many closings. They had files for so many closings in New Bedford. It was like you didn't even have to go to the registry to do a title search, because the law firm was Crapo, Clifford, and Prescott had done so much of the transactions of the development of the city during that time. It was like going to the registry of deeds. You didn't have to go to the registry of deeds. All you do is go to their files, because they had done so many closings in New Bedford for so many years. Now, I could go on and on about him. This is a nice story about him. One of his clients was Hetty Green. She was one of his clients. And he tells the story, the first time he met Hetty Green, she would come Hetty always owned a lot of property in New Bedford, especially, she owned all the land, like on Rockdale Avenue and beyond where the cemetery is now, most of Buttonwood Park, all kinds of land in the West End. She still owned that land during her lifetime, at the end of her life. All that land was developed after she died in 1916. So she would come by the law office every once in a while with her satchel and the way she looks in pictures with her big black outfit and so forth, and check on her investments. So Oliver reported that if you walked out of the office, she would take everything that was on the desk and put it in her satchel. She would just clean up, she would just steal everything on the desk, put it in her satchel. So he learned when Hetty was coming to the law office not to leave anything on the desk, because it would be gone, because you weren't going to challenge her, that's for sure. Not a client like that who was a multi-hundred millionaire client. The other thing that has to be mentioned about Oliver and his two sisters is they're the ones who donated and commissioned the glass mosaic picture tile wall in the Unitarian Church. The most important piece of decorative art in New Bedford by far. Nothing even matches it. There's only one other item like that in the country, is someplace in Philadelphia. 300 square feet, 500 pieces of stained glass by the Tiffany company to make the mural behind the altar at the Unitarian Church. If you haven't seen it, it's beyond belief, really, to realize the beauty and the work that went into it. It took months and months to put every piece together, to do the scene of a pilgrim walking in the wilderness. I don't know, there's a story behind it. I guess there was a poem or a story about that particular scene that was replicated by the mural. But if you ever have, the Unitarian Church is open. If you haven't been in there, the Unitarian Church is open a lot on AHA night, and it's worth seeing. It's so spectacular. And they commissioned that, Oliver, and because he was the head of the lay community at the church for most of his life, they commissioned that around 1911. And it was really one of the great gifts. Must have cost a fortune, really, to buy and have the work done. But really a tremendous asset to the city at the Unitarian Church. This house behind me isn't part of the tour, but for those that haven't been on a tour before, everybody's got to be able to have a little bit of intro to this house. This is one of the great, I think probably the greatest residential property in New Bedford. And if you haven't been on a tour before, which I'm sure many of you haven't been, you got to see this place. This is a house built in the 1840s in the Gothic Revival style. And again, it was a Roach family house. You could see all the fancy gingerbread inside the big gables and stuff, typical of that style. This really was a very important architect. His name was Alexander Jackson Davis, that designed this house. And this ended up really being this design was his calling card house because it was so famous. It's a landmark property, which means that this is the highest designation that a historic property can get in the United States as landmark status. There's only a few of those in New Bedford. This house is a house designed by an architect, a New Bedford architect by the name of Edgar B. Hammond. He's a very, very important guy in the history of the architecture of New Bedford during the period from really 1875 to 1930. His father was an architect. He was an architect. He designed houses, but basically he was a builder. His houses are not as interesting as Edgar. Edgar had a very, very keen eye for design. He went to MIT for a year to learn more about design and structures and so forth. So he was well trained, and he's done a lot of interesting buildings in the city. Other than this house really is one of his gems as far as residential architecture is concerned. 1916. It's kind of a almost a direct copy to some degree of colonial houses built in places like Newport and Salem and so forth. He put a few twists on it here and there, but it's just a beautiful design, very balanced. It's always been in tip-top shape. This house still is. Lots of detailing. You can see the little brackets under the eaves, nice entryway. I mean, it's just a beautiful house. If you look at history books of colonial architecture, you'll see houses like this often, with the dormers, 3 or 4, even more dormers across the top. And he kind of replicated that design, but nonetheless, it's a beautiful house. Now his catalog of buildings in New Bedford is extremely long and distinguished. Perhaps his most, well, I wouldn't even say his most anything, because anybody could pick out some of his great buildings. But the Duff Building rather, in downtown New Bedford, the big house I talked about earlier on Pleasant Street, was designed by Edgar Hammond. He also designed the building that now houses Freestones. He has houses throughout the city. If you've been on my tours, I mention him all the time. There's another house we might walk by when we go back to RJD that on the corner. I'll point that out. Lots of residential properties. And in his day, he did a lot of public buildings as well, police stations, firehouses. He was very, very active. And one of his most interesting and well-known now commissions is he designed the Bourne Building at the Whaling Museum and the Lagoda. He was responsible for overseeing the building of the model of the whale ship Lagoda in the Whaling Museum. That was a pretty interesting commission. I don't think he was a sailor by any means. Well, he was a sailor, actually. I shouldn't say that. He was a sailor. So maybe that's one of the reasons why he was tapped for the job. But anyway, that project is very well known for that. But he did projects throughout the city, almost too many to enumerate. Now, he was also very involved with yachting. Now, he didn't have, as an architect, he made some money, but he didn't make the money that the other people that we've talked about, John Duff, he was nowhere near that category. Oliver Prescott, Edgar he lived in his father's house actually on North Street all his life, so he didn't have to pay rent or mortgage, I guess. So he saved money that way, but he always had a yacht. He was very, very interested in the Bedford Yacht Club. The first yacht club, there'll be a picture of it on the video, was on Pope's Island. If you're familiar with where Captain Leroy's is now, it's a charter place. That's where the yacht club was. Beautiful stick-style building. It was on pilings, in the harbor, and that was the original New Bedford Yacht Club, built around 1878 or 9. Hammond was pretty young at the time, but I don't think his father could have pulled off that design. I think for sure he designed that original yacht club. Very cool building, in a unique style. And he also designed the yacht club that currently stands, the New Bedford Yacht Club that currently stands in Paden. So he was a yachtsman himself. I don't know how they do things, but he was the commodore of the club. That must be some kind of either honorary or maybe real leadership designation for the yacht club. So he was very interested in the yacht club, and that was one of his things. Oddly, around late 20s, the yacht club wanted to remodel the interior of the building in Paden. But they didn't hire Hammond. I don't know why that is the case. They hired a guy named Nat Smith. And I did a project about Nat Smith a few years ago, and he was the subject of one of our walking tours a couple of years ago. And for some reason, they hired Smith to do the job. Hammond must have been just done with architecture, didn't want to do it anymore. Maybe he couldn't do it anymore. I don't know. He didn't die. He died in 1937, so he could have done the job. But anyway, gave it to Smith. But anyway, he was a very active man. His rap sheet is not as long as far as other things other than being in the yacht club and also being an architect, because they weren't making that kind of money. Edgar B. Hammond, he was born in 1854, I believe, and died in 1937. The VIP for this house is a lady by the name of Rachel Howland. She was born in New Jersey, Quaker woman, born in, I think, 1916, and died in 1902. She was married to Matthew Howland. Her name was Rachel Smith, actually. But she married Matthew Howland, who was a whaling merchant, very successful whaling merchant. And they built this house for themselves here. Now, originally, this house was more like the house we just saw with all the gingerbread in the columns. It was a Gothic revival. And the basic form of the house hasn't changed much, but all the detailing has been stripped off. There are pictures of this house with a full porch and the 4-column type of Gothic post, all the gingerbread in the columns and so forth. That's the way the house originally was built, in the Gothic revival style. There are pictures of that I think I still have, that we can put in the video so you can see what it looked like when the Howlands lived in it. Now, the Howlands were well-to-do whaling merchants during the golden age of whaling. They were making lots of money. They owned all the land across the street to Grove Street. They also owned property in the south end, half of Hazelwood Park, all the way north to where the roads are now. There's an intersection there, but they owned all that land as well. You know that little building that nobody ever knows what it is? It's behind it's not the big stone one, but the one next to it. That was Rachel's summer house. It was a barn originally, but then it was converted to she converted it to a residential property as a summer house. And the clubhouse, or the white building that's there now, which was I think a community center, that was her son's house at one time. He built a house on the site too. So they owned a lot of land. And Rachel was a kind of a living legend in her own time. She was a very forceful woman in the Quaker community. Early on, she was recognized as an outstanding speaker. One of the great virtues of the Society of Friends, Quakers, was their feeling about equality. Women had no rights really during this time, but the Quakers encouraged women to speak at meetings, and if they were good speakers, they were given permission to speak at other congregations, other meetings, and even other churches if they were invited. And Rachel was one of them. She was very, very influential lady. She spoke all over the Northeast, really. She was invited to speak in New York, every place during her lifetime. She was very well respected. She also, in New Bedford, is responsible for all sorts of charities. The relief of aged women, there was a city mission. A lot of them had to do with women's issues, but not exclusively. She and her husband built a chapel for the workers, a non-denominational chapel for the workers at the Wamsutter Mill at that end of Purchase Street. She did all sorts of things. And she was well respected. And she was no wallflower either, because at one point there was kind of a dust up in New York about Presbyterians not wanting to let a Quaker preacher speak. Oh boy, and Howland was all over that like a wet blanket. She was ripping the minister of that church in the papers very sarcastically, really. It was pretty brutal, really. So she was a very, very forceful woman. In to show her the respect that she had in the community, in the 1860s, the late 1860s, after the Civil War, there was a big strike at the Wamsutter Mill over the 10-hour day. The workers in Fall River had negotiated a 10-hour day, from 11 to 10 hours. It was a big deal. It doesn't seem like a big deal now. It was a big deal to lose that, to make that 1 hour. And it looked like it was going to be enacted as law in the Commonwealth. The 10-hour day would be enacted as a law. You could not ask workers to work more than 10 hours a day. And so it looked like, everything was fine, and the workers in Bedford thought, well, we can get this the 10-hour day. But the leader of the mill just dug his heels in and didn't want to allow this to happen, even though it was probably going to be passed by the legislature. Anyway, there was a strike, and it was very contentious. It was unexpected, actually. They thought they would get it, and it was unexpected. And they actually, both the management and the workers asked Rachel to see if they could mediate the strike. Now, to ask a woman to mediate a business like this was an unbelievable, really, responsibility. And she really wasn't, the history books, a lot of the history books say that she was successful. She wasn't successful, actually. She got everybody to sit down, talk with one another, but the only thing that got the 10-hour day was the legislature actually passing the law, which forced New Bedford to give them the 10-hour day. But nonetheless, just being called in, having that kind of respect, was a big deal. Now, Rachel, at the end of her life, had some tragedy. In the 1870s, the whaling industry was doing most of their whaling in the Arctic Ocean, the Western Arctic off the coast of Alaska and Siberia. And they had weather anomalies in 2 separate years and the fleets were lost. And they hurt the Howlands tremendously, their finances tremendously. So much so that they couldn't even pay for their estate. They were in arrears. An estate this size took an army of people. They had probably a dozen people who worked on the estate full time. They couldn't even pay them, really. And things were going south badly, financially. And when Matthew died, her husband died in 1884, the creditors took the property and kicked Rachel out of the house. Now that was very unusual. Often these foreclosures and these bankruptcies and stuff happened a lot, but when people, the pillars of the community usually got to keep their houses, but Rachel was kicked out and she was not thrilled about that. It was a big blow to her. It didn't stop her from continuing to work on things. She organized something called the Instructional Nurses Association, a chapter in New Bedford, which was going to help women. There were so many women working in the textile industry. The infant mortality rate was so high that, and it was mostly because the women had to work, they had to leave their babies. Babies weren't getting nutrition and so forth. So the Instructional Nurses Association was formed. She formed the chapter here. Even late in life, she was still active. But in 1897, her youngest son, who was the leader of the Howland Mills, which is an important mill site here in New Bedford at the time, Howland Place in the South End, I'm sure people are familiar with that. That was his mill. He got involved in a scandal. It was really his mismanagement there was a strike at the time. He mismanaged the funds, didn't really anticipate how long the strike would go, and the mill was going to fail. And when he knew it was going to fail, he committed suicide. That was the kicker for Rachel, I think. She left New Bedford, went to live with one of her sons in Providence, and it was probably very shameful for her to have so much tragedy in her life, especially her son losing her life, losing the mill. It was just a disaster. Lots of people lost lots of money in the failure of the mill, and it was just too bad. The White House was the home of John H. Clifford, the only man from New Bedford to become governor of the Commonwealth. And Clifford was a very interesting guy. He was a politician, sort of a politician. He really liked being Attorney General of the Commonwealth. And it wasn't elected then, it was appointed by the legislature. So he must have been a popular guy because various parties would continue to select him as Attorney General, which was very unusual at the time. But he became governor for one term, didn't like it, and went back to being Attorney General until they decided to elect it. And he didn't like elections, apparently, because then he decided he would not run for election. But anyway, good, interesting guy, very well connected. One of his best friends was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court in the Commonwealth. His name was Lemuel Shaw, S-H-A-W. And Judge Shaw was one of the most important judges in the country. Judge Shaw is responsible for a couple of major things that are still popular, that are still in the legal system today. Circumstantial evidence and reasonable doubt. He invented those precedents during various trials that he conducted. And his daughter married Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. And here's the story on this particular tour, because they all intertwine here. Melville was a nobody when he first came to New Bedford in 1840. He came to New Bedford in December of 1840 to ship out on a whale ship called the Acushnet. And the whale ship left in, I think, like January 1st or 2nd, 1841. And from that one voyage, he took the voyage, he jumped ship in the Pacific Ocean. He hopped around, island hopped around for a while in places that had cannibals and stuff. And he had a very interesting life when he was out there. And he produced some books that were, kind of travelogues and adventure stories about his life out there. And then he produced his masterpiece, Moby Dick. So he was a celebrity for a little while, a minor celebrity, but nonetheless well known. And he was married to Judge Shaw's daughter. So at one point, Judge Shaw, even though he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court, the highest judge in the state, he still did circuit duty. So they were going to do circuit duty in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. And he asked Herman, hey, you want to go down to do circuit duty with me? We're going to go down and stay with Governor Clifford for a while. Then all three of us are going to go do circuit duty in Nantucket. So Herman said, yeah, let's do it. And he went, and because he had tremendous respect for Judge Shaw. He said he was a great man among great men, about the highest praise that you can make for somebody. So they went into circuit duty. And they went to Nantucket, and Judge Shaw cleared cases and so forth. And at night they'd hang out with the gang in Nantucket, and and sit and smoke cigars and drink Madeira. And while at one of these sessions, John Clifford told a story that an interesting case he was working on, a case of a polygamist, a guy who turns out to have families all over the East Coast. One of those families was in Massachusetts, and there was a lawsuit going on about this guy and his wife. And the wife was a very interesting person, as it turns out, according to Clifford. And he told this story to Herman, and Herman was pretty intrigued by it. He said, he thought about it. He mulled it over for a while. After the trip was over, they came back home, and he said, and he developed a story for it. He thought it was a good story. Now, Melville had published Moby Dick in 1851, and it was wasn't reviewed. It wasn't that well received, actually. It was not badly received, but it wasn't the big hit he thought it would be. Thought it was his great work, and it was his great work. But people didn't really get it. Thought it was, they didn't really get it as much as he thought they would. And then he published another volume of another story, another novel called Pierre, which was a total flop. It was, nobody liked it. Even he had an English publisher who actually read the manuscript, said, I'm not even publishing this. It was so bad in their view. It was a big flop. So he's working off that. This is the next project. He's trying to find a new project, and he decides, maybe I'll write the story that John Clifford gave me. He thought it was pretty interesting about this thing, called the story Isle of the Cross. It took him a long time to write it, because it was a complex story, and he wanted to it was an actual case, so he had to change the names to protect the innocent and all that. But it took him a long time to write the story. Melville finishes the Isle of the Cross, submits it to his publisher, and they say, no, we're not going to publish this. He worked so hard on this. For some reason, he spent a lot of time on this. He agonized over it, published it, thought it was decent, and he submits it to his publisher, and they say, no, we don't want to publish it. And he just gave up on it. And the Isle of the Cross is known to have been written by Melville. It's in the archives of the Hopper and Brothers was the publisher, and so they know the thing was written, but it's never been found. It just disappeared. So people are still looking for it. They're hoping it appears someday. Like Billy Budd, one of his other things, he wrote the manuscript, and it was tucked away in a trunk that was almost thrown out, and not discovered until I think the 1920s or the teens or something like that. So people are still thinking that the Isle of the Cross will show up sooner or later about this polygamist and his meanderings and the girls and so forth that he betrayed. But anyway, interesting story about Melville and his relationship to New Bedford. While he was in New Bedford the second time, visiting here, staying at this particular house. When he first came, he was just ragamuffin sailor looking for the lowest job. And when he came back in the 1850s, kind of a celebrity, had lunch at the James Arnold Mansion, got to visit the other gents, as they called them at the time, in New Bedford. So it was kind of cool. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you again on another tour.